Hey there. Tonight we're slipping into a different kind of night visitor. Not one who startles, but one who lingers, quiet and patient. Like the final echo of a fading dream, the Greeks believed the night was not something to fear loudly, but something to understand gently, the way you understand the weight of your own blanket when sleep is already halfway holding you. If these slow ancient stories bring you a little calm, maybe consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or leaving a quiet comment about where in the world you're listening from, only if it feels peaceful to you. No pressure at all. It's just comforting to know we're not the only ones resting under these old myth-filled skies. So settle in, soften your breathing, and let your mind drift as we wander back to a world where the night had manners, shadows had stories, and even the heaviest weight was simply a lesson waiting to be understood in the long darkness before dawn. When even the watch dogs of farmsteads lie still and the owls have folded their wings, the ancient Greeks knew that the boundary between worlds grew thin, not at midnight. That hour belongs to more theatrical fears. No, the true threshold came in the deepest part of night, somewhere between the third and fourth watch, when the body has grown heavy with unnatural sleep and the mind, restless, begins to wander the corridors of itself. It was then that the Oniroi came. They were not gods in the grand sense, not thundering Zeus nor arrow singing Artemis. They were something older, quieter, more intimate, children of Nyx, the primordial night, and brothers to death and sleep themselves. Hesiod named them in his careful tally of cosmic genealogy, thousands upon thousands, fluttering black, winged, soft-feathered, born from the same dark womb that birthed the Fates and the Hesperides. They had no single temple, no festival with torches and hymns. Their worship was involuntary. Every mortal paid it nightly, whether they wished to or not. The Greeks did not think of dreams as harmless entertainment or random firings of the brain. Dreams were visitations, portents, conversations with something that knew you better than you knew yourself. And the Oniroi were the messengers, or sometimes the jailers, who carried those conversations into the sleeping mind. Most were gentle. They came on quiet wings, slipping through the keyhole or under the door like smoke. Homer describes them emerging from two gates in the underworld, one of polished horn, the other of gleaming ivory. Dreams that pass through the gate of horn are true, clear, prophetic, heavy with meaning that must be deciphered upon waking. Dreams that slip through ivory are false, beautiful lies. Seductive shapes that dissolve at dawn, leaving only a vague aftertaste of sweetness or shame. But not every dream arrived through a gate. Some came through no gate at all. They came sideways, through cracks no architect could seal, through the soft place where the skull meets the spine, through the open mouth of the sleeper who had forgotten to close it against the dark. These were the ones that did not knock. These were the ones that settled on the chest like wet wool, pressed the ribs inward until breath became a labour, turned limbs to stone while the mind screamed silently inside its cage. The Greeks had a name for that particular visitor, Epiles. The name itself is a hiss, Epiles, the one who leaps upon. Not a grand demon with horns and whip, but something far worse, a small, insistent, intimate. A weight no heavier than a cat, yet impossible to throw off. Ancient medical writers would later call it panikos, panic, but the older, truer word was epiales, the presser, the smotherer, the one who sits astride the sleeper and rides the nightmare like a horse until the first grey light. He was not always alone. Sometimes he brought cousins, shadowy shapes without names, half seen at the corners of vision, whispering things the waking mind would never allow. They did not speak in sentences. They spoke in pressure, in sudden cold at the base of the neck, in the certainty that something is watching from the foot of the bed and will not look away until it has finished watching. The sleeper knew, even in the locked prison of paralysis, that these were not ordinary dreams. These were incursions. The body lay still, heart hammering against ribs that refused to rise. The mind raced, screamed, begged the limbs to move. To sit up, to strike at the thing on the chest. Nothing answered. Only the slow, deliberate weight increased. And somewhere in the room, or inside the skull, a soft rustle of wings, the brush of feathers against stone, the quiet click of talons settling on the bed frame. The Oneiroi had many forms. Some appeared as beautiful young men with long curling hair and gentle hands. Some came as women with eyes like polished obsidian. Some came as animals, black dogs with human faces, white horses whose breath smelled of iron, snakes that coiled around wrists and ankles without biting. But Epiales rarely bothered with form. He was pressure. He was suffocation. He was the moment when the dreamer realizes the dream is not going to end politely at dawn. And yet, even in terror, there was structure. The Greeks believed these visitations followed rules. Certain offerings could keep Epiales away. A black ewe sacrificed at a crossroads at midnight. Its blood poured into a pit, while the name of Hypnos was whispered 3 times. A sprig of mugwort placed beneath the pillow. A small bronze figure of a rooster, sacred to the sun, and therefore hostile to night spirits, set on the windowsill. Most importantly, never sleep on your back. The supine position invited the presser. Side, sleeping, especially with the left side down, was said to let the spirit slide off more easily. It rarely worked, because Epiales did not come because he was summoned. He came because the sleeper had left the door open. Not a physical door, the door of the mind. The Greeks understood that sleep is not simply rest. It is a temporary death. The soul, or some part of it, leaves the body and wanders. While it wanders, the body lies undefended. The Oneiroi know this. They wait for the moment when the soul is farthest away, when the tether between mind and flesh is stretched thinnest. Then they step through. And Epiales waits longest of all. He does not need beauty or terror to make his entrance. He needs only weight. Weight enough to remind the sleeper, even as panic floods every nerve, that the body is a borrowed thing. That breath is loaned. That movement is permitted only until it is not. And in that long moment between paralysis and waking, when the chest refuses to rise and the scream dies in the throat, the sleeper learns the oldest lesson of the night. Some visitors do not knock. Some doors were never meant to be closed. And some waits, once they have settled, do not leave until they are finished with you. The Greeks never imagined dreams arriving by accident. Every night, when the body surrendered to Hypnos and the soul drifted free of its heavy mooring. But 2 doorways stood waiting in the sunless country, beyond the western ocean. Homer described them with the calm precision of someone who had seen both gates open and close. One was fashioned of gleaming ivory, smooth, pale, almost luminous in the dark. Through this gate passed the dreams that flatter and deceive. They wore beautiful shapes. Lost lovers returning with open arms, enemies falling without a fight, harvests ripening without drought or locust. They spoke in honeyed voices, promising futures that felt so real the sleeper could taste the wine and smell the myrrh. Yet when dawn touched the eastern rim and the eyelids fluttered, these visitors dissolved like mist. Nothing remained but a vague sweetness on the tongue, a lingering warmth in the chest, and, sometimes, the slow, sickening realization that the joy had never been earned. The other gate was made of polished horn. Its surface was translucent yet hard, veined like the finest amber, catching and bending the faint starlight that filtered down into the underworld. Dreams that stepped through horn were true, not always kind, rarely comforting, but accurate. They arrived without ornament. A battlefield already red with tomorrow's blood, a child's face grown old overnight, a ship's mast cracking in a storm that had not yet risen. These visions left no afterglow of pleasure. They left weight. The sleeper woke with the taste of iron in the mouth, the memory of cold stone under bare feet, the certainty that something irrevocable had been shown and could not now be unseen. Mortals had no say in which gate would open on any given night. The choice belonged to the oniroi themselves. Most of the dream, brothers were polite, or at least indifferent. They filed through whichever portal the moment called for, delivering their messages and departing without lingering. A farmer might receive an ivory dream of golden wheat that never grew. A general might wake from a horn dream with the exact layout of tomorrow's ambush already mapped in his mind. Both were accepted as part of the night's contract. Sleep was not refuge, it was embassy. The soul went abroad, received dispatches and returned, sometimes wiser, sometimes merely bruised. But there were always exceptions. Some oniroi refused both gates. They did not wait for ivory or horn. They found other ways in, but through the crack beneath the door, the open mouth of the snorer, the unguarded fontanelle of a child still soft at the crown. These were the ones who did not carry messages so much as burdens. They settled first on the chest, then deeper, into the diaphragm, into the throat, into the place where breath turns to panic when it cannot find exit. The sleeper felt them arrive, not as vision, but as pressure. A weight no heavier than a folded cloak, yet impossible to lift, arms pinned, legs locked, lungs refusing to expand beyond the shallowest sip. The Greeks called this state epileptics, the pressing. Later medical writers would speak of it as paralysis of sleep, but the older term was more honest. Epiales had come. He was not beautiful like some of his brothers. He did not arrive with wings of midnight blue or a face that could pass for mortal. He was shadow made tactile, a density, a smothering that knew exactly how much air to allow, just enough to keep the heart racing, never enough to let the scream escape. His presence was announced not by sound, but by silence. The sudden cessation of cricket, song outside the window, the way the lamp flame stopped flickering and stood unnaturally still, the abrupt knowledge that the room, once familiar, had become slightly too small. The sleeper knew, even as terror flooded every nerve, that this was not random cruelty. Epiles had rules. He came most often to those who had left something unresolved before lying down, a vow unkept, a name spoken in anger and never retracted, a door left unbarred, a prayer begun and never finished. He was drawn to loose threads. The mind that went to sleep, still clutching at the day's unfinished business, was the mind most vulnerable to his weight. And he did not come alone. Behind him, or perhaps inside him, moved the lesser night, spirits, nameless shapes that brushed the edges of vision, whispered single syllables that were never quite words, pressed cold fingers against the soles of feet that could not kick. They did not need names because they were not individuals. They were extensions of the pressure itself, the panic that lives in the gap between I want to move and I cannot. Yet even Epiles had limits. He could not stay past first light. The moment the eastern sky paled, even before the rooster's first uncertain crow, the weight began to lift. Not suddenly, slowly, reluctantly, like a hand withdrawing from a throat it had held all night. The sleeper felt ribs remember how to rise, lungs remember how to fill, throat remember how to make sound. The scream that had been locked inside burst free, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in the mind, and the room snapped back into ordinary proportion. But the memory remained, not as a clear picture, as sensation, as the ghost of pressure that could return the next night, or the next, whenever the sleeper again forgot to close every door before lying down. The Greeks understood this. They did not call it illness. They called it visitation. They did not seek to banish it with medicine alone. They sought to negotiate. A black ewe at the crossroads, a sprig of mugwort under the pillow, a bronze rooster on the sill, and always, always, the habit of sleeping on the side, never on the back, never inviting the presser to mount, because they knew. Some nights the gate of horn opens, some nights the gate of ivory opens, and some nights no gate opens at all. Some nights something simply steps through the place where the sleeper forgot to set a guard, and waits until the sleeper remembers, in the locked cage of their own ribs, that sleep is never entirely safe. The moment of greatest danger was never the arrival of Epiles. It was the instant that followed, the instant when the sleeper understood, with perfect crystalline clarity, that the body no longer answered. The Greeks called this state nyktal sis, night, binding, though the word itself was rarely spoken aloud. To name it too often was to invite it. Better to refer to it sideways. The heavy one came again, or the chest remembers last night, or simply depressed. Everyone knew what meant. No further explanation was required. The body lay supine, almost always supine. No matter how carefully the sleeper had arranged the bedding on their side before closing their eyes. Somehow, in the drift toward unconsciousness, the position had shifted. Back flat against the woven mat or straw pallet, arms usually at the sides or slightly raised, legs straight, chin tilted just enough to open the airway, and to offer the throat to whatever wished to settle there. Then the weight arrives, not sudden, not crashing, gradual, like wet snow accumulating on a roof until the timbers groan. First a tightness across the diaphragm, then a reluctance in the ribs. Then the certainty that the next breath will be shallower than the last. By the time the sleeper registers the change, the chest is already committed to stillness. Lungs demand more air, the ribs refuse to lift. The heart races to compensate. Thud, thud, thud against bone that will not yield, and panic blooms in the mind like ink dropped in water. The eyes are usually open, not wide, not frantic, merely open, because the sleeper has sensed something amiss and tried to look around. But the eyelids, too, are heavy. They rise halfway and stay there, trembling at the effort. Through the narrow slit the room is visible, exactly as it was when sleep took hold, the same clay lamp, the same loom in the corner, the same shapes of family sleeping nearby. Yet everything is wrong. The lamp flame stands unnaturally still. The shadows do not flicker. The breathing of the sleepers beside them is too regular, too quiet, as though someone has pressed a finger to every throat in the room. And then the sense of being watched, not from across the room, not from the doorway, from above, from directly above the face. Something is there, not heavy enough to be a body, not light enough to be imagination. It has no face, or perhaps it has too many. The sleeper can never quite focus. Peripheral vision registers movement, a shifting of darkness at the edges, but when the trapped eyes try to track it, nothing is there. Only pressure. Only the slow, deliberate increase of weight across sternum and throat. The sleeper tries to call out. The throat works. The diaphragm contracts. Air moves, but no sound emerges. The scream is formed perfectly in the mind, loud, desperate, shaped around every childhood fear and every adult shame, yet it dies at the vocal cords. The mouth opens, the tongue stirs. No more than a thin wheeze escapes. Sometimes not even that. Just the whistle of air forced through a narrowing passage. Panic becomes terror, becomes something colder, certainty. This is not a dream that will end when the sleeper wakes up. This is the state in which waking has already happened, and nothing has changed. The Greeks believed epials could be bargained with, but only if the sleeper remembered the rules in time. First rule: do not fight the weight. Struggle feeds it. Every frantic attempt to lift an arm, to roll the torso, to kick the legs only tightens the coils. Better to go limp, utterly limp, and let the mind retreat to a small, safe place behind the eyes. Second rule: count the breaths, even the shallow ones. Counting gives the soul something to hold. 1, 2, 3. The numbers are real when nothing else is. Third rule: remember the name of sleep himself. Hypnos, brother of Epials, father of the Oneiroi. To whisper his name, even silently, is to remind the presser that he is only a guest in the house of his elder brother. Hypnos does not like his rest disturbed by lesser kin making too much commotion. Most importantly, never look directly at the thing above you. To meet its gaze, if it has eyes, is to give it permission to stay longer. Better to fix on a single point the crack in the ceiling beam, the shape of the loom, the slow drip of wax from the lamp. Anchor the mind there. Let the weight do what it will to the body. The body is only on loan tonight anyway. Then, eventually, light. Not sudden dawn. Not the rooster's crow. Just the first pale grey at the eastern window. A thinning of the dark. A slight lifting at the edges. The weight hesitates. It never leaves willingly. It lingers, a last deliberate press, as though to remind the sleeper who was master for these long minutes. Then, slowly, grudgingly, it withdraws, first from the throat, then the chest, then the legs. Breath returns in a ragged gasp. Limbs jerk once, violently, as control floods back. The scream that was locked inside finally escapes, half sob, half shout, and wakes the household. The sleeper sits up, chest heaving, hands clutching at the place where the weight had settled. Family gathers. Someone lights another lamp. Someone brings water. Someone murmurs the proper words. It passed. It has gone. No one asks for details. Everyone knows the details already. They are the same every time. Outside, the sky is turning rose. The sleeper drinks the water, shivers, touches their own chest where the pressure had been, finds no mark, no bruise, only the memory of weight. A memory that will fade during the day, but sharpen again as soon as the eyelids grow heavy tomorrow night. And somewhere, in the borderland between sleep and waking, between horn and ivory, Epiales folds his wings, settles back into shadow, and waits, patient, unhurried, knowing the sleeper will return. Because every night the same door is left ajar, and every night he is invited in, simply by lying down. The Greeks did not speak Epiales' name loudly, not at dinner tables, not in the marketplace, not even in the safety of daylight. To say it aloud was to risk summoning him early, before the lamps were lit and the doors barred. Instead they used circumlocutions, half phrases, gestures, a hand laid flat across the chest, a slow exhalation through pursed lips, a single word dropped into conversation like a stone into deep water. It came again. Everyone at the table understood. Heads would nod. Eyes would drop to plates. The talk would turn quickly to safer things. The price of barley, the new moon's omen, the neighbour's lame goat. No one asked for details. Details were private. Details belonged to the dark. Yet in the hours after midnight, when sleep had already taken half the household, and the other half lay rigid waiting for dawn. The names came anyway. They were whispered, barely voiced, into the crook of an elbow, into the pillow, into the small space between mattress and wall where no one else could hear. Mothers murmured them to feverish children. Husbands breathed them to wives who woke gasping. Old women crooned them like lullabies in reverse, not to soothe, but to ward. Son of Nyx, brother of Hypnos, the presser, the heavy one, Epialdes. Each name was a key. Each key turned in a lock that should have stayed shut. Yet the sleeper could not help but speak it, the way a tongue cannot resist probing a broken tooth. Saying the name was part confession, part plea, part desperate attempt to make the thing real enough to bargain with. Because Epiales could be bargained with. Not easily, not reliably. But the old women who kept the household, cults knew certain formulas. They were never written down. Writing gave them power over the speaker rather than over the spirit. But they were taught mouth to ear, generation to generation, always in the dark. The simplest rite required only 3 things: a black thread, a bronze needle, and absolute quiet. When the wait came, when the chest refused to rise, and the scream died unborn, the sleeper must begin the thread work without hesitation. No fumbling, no panic. The needle must be threaded in darkness. The black wool pulled through with steady fingers, and 9 small stitches made into the hem of the sleeper's garment. Always 9, never more, never less. With each stitch a single word was breathed, not spoken aloud, only shaped on the lips. 1. Hypnos. 2. Let go. 3. Brother. 4. Release. 5. Wait. 6. Lift. 7. Dawn. 8. Light. 9. Gone. The stitches did not need to be beautiful. They needed only to be finished before the 10th breath that would otherwise never come. When the 9th stitch was knotted, always knotted, never cut, the sleeper must then place the threaded needle beneath the pillow, point facing outward, and whisper once more, "Epioles you have pressed. Now pass." If the rite was done correctly, if no sound had escaped, if the stitches were even, if the needle pointed away from the heart, the weight would hesitate. It would linger a moment longer than usual, as though considering whether to honour the bargain. Then, slowly, grudgingly, it would slide sideways, off the chest, across the ribs, down the side of the pallet, and into the floorboards, where the shadows were deepest. The sleeper would feel the sudden return of breath like cold water poured over fevered skin. Limbs would unlock. Eyes would close and open again, this time under their own command. But the rite was never certain. Sometimes the stitches were hurried. Sometimes the needle slipped. Sometimes the sleeper, in blind panic, spoke a name aloud instead of breathing it. Then Epioles stayed. Not forever, never forever, but longer than the body could endure without breaking. There were stories told in low voices around winter hearths of men and women found cold at dawn, eyes wide, mouths open in a scream that had never found air, chests unmarked yet crushed inward, as though by a stone no one could lift. These were the ones who had named him too loudly, or offered the wrong thread, or forgotten the 9th knot, or, worst of all, looked directly upward when the weight first settled, meeting whatever passed for eyes in that darkness. To look was to invite permanence. To speak was to invite return. To struggle was to feed him. The only true defense was acceptance, utter, terrifying acceptance. Let the weight come. Let it press. Let it stay until it was satisfied. Fight nothing. Name nothing. Simply count the breaths, 1, 2, 3, until the eastern sky paled and the first bird stirred on its roost. Then, and only then, would Epioles withdraw, leaving behind no mark except the memory of pressure and the certainty that he would come again, because he always came again. The Greeks understood this. They did not call it illness. They did not call it superstition. They called it night, and night, like every other ancient force, had its etiquette, its bargains, its prices, and its patient, waiting names, whispered only when the lamp is out, the door is barred, and the sleeper has already forgotten how to keep the dark on the other side of the eyelids. Dawn was never certain, even when the sky paled in the east and the first thin grey light slipped under the door, epiles could linger. He had no obligation to leave exactly when the rooster crowed. The bird's call was only a suggestion, a reminder, not a command. Some nights he stayed longer, pressing just enough to make the sleeper doubt whether morning had truly arrived. The room would lighten, shapes would sharpen, yet the weight remained stubborn, intimate, almost thoughtful, as though the spirit were saying, "I could go, but I choose not to. Not yet." The Greeks learned this the hard way. They learned it in farmhouses where the rooster had been eaten by a fox 2 nights before. In city tenements where no birds were kept. In mountain villages too high for cocks to survive the winters. They learned it when children woke blue, lipped and gasping, while the rest of the household snored on. When young wives found themselves pinned beneath invisible husbands who would not rise. When old men felt their hearts labour against ribs that refused to expand. Dawn alone was not enough. Protection had to be prepared in advance. Deliberate, physical, stubborn as the presser himself. The first and oldest defence was position. Never sleep on the back. The supine body invited epiles the way an open palm invites a coin. Chest exposed, throat undefended, limbs splayed. Every line of the body said, "Mount here." Side, sleeping was safer, the left side safest of all. Curling onto the left, compressed the heart slightly, made the lungs work harder, reminded the body it was still alive, and therefore not entirely available for occupation. Mothers taught daughters to lie down with the left shoulder against the mattress first. Husbands reminded wives. Even infants were rolled gently onto their left sides the moment their eyes closed. Left down. The grandmothers whispered. Always left down. The second defence was plant matter. Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, bitter and silver, green, was the most trusted. A sprig picked at the dark of the moon, tied with black thread, laid beneath the pillow or sewn into the hem of the sleeping garment. Its sharp, camphor scent was said to offend the night spirits. Its jagged leaves reminded them of thorns. Some households kept a small clay pot of mugwort growing near the bed, watered only with rainwater collected at midnight. When a sleeper woke trembling, they were told to crush a leaf between finger and thumb and breathe the oil directly, a sharp, medicinal slap that could drive lingering pressure from the lungs faster than any prayer. The third defence was bronze. Roosters were sacred to Helios and, by extension, hostile to anything that thrived in darkness. A small bronze figure of a cock, no larger than a thumb, set on the windowsill or hung above the bed on red cord, was thought to keep epials at a distance. The metal caught and reflected even the weakest light. The bird's vigilant posture reminded the spirit that dawn was inevitable. In wealthier homes the bronze rooster was gilded, its beak sharp enough to draw blood if touched carelessly. In poorer houses it was only a rough casting, but no less potent for its simplicity. Many a sleeper, waking suddenly with chest free and limbs their own again, swore they had heard the faint, metallic crow of bronze just before the weight lifted. The fourth defence was blood. Not much, never much. A single drop from a pricked finger smeared on the doorpost before retiring, or, more commonly, the blood of a black ewe sacrificed, at the next crossroads at midnight, but caught in a clay bowl and poured into a pit while the name of Hypnos was spoken 3 times backward. The pit was covered with stones, never soil. Soil would let the offering rise again. Crossroads were liminal places, where 3 roads met, where Hecate walked, where choices were made and unmade. Epiiles being a creature of thresholds, respected crossroads. A proper offering there could buy several nights of untroubled sleep. But no defence was perfect. Mugwort could be forgotten. The sleeper could roll onto their back in the middle of the night. The bronze rooster could be knocked to the floor by a restless child. The crossroads offering could be dug up by dogs or washed away by rain. And Epiiles, patient, precise, would wait for the single mistake. When he returned heavier. The weight was not always the same. Some nights it felt like a folded cloak. Others, like a child sitting on the chest. On the worst nights it felt like a full, grown man, knees pinning wrists, hands pressing down on shoulders, face so close the sleeper could feel breath that carried no warmth. The eyes, if there were eyes, were never seen clearly. Only darkness where eyes should be, darkness that looked back. And always, always, the same invitation to struggle. To fight was to feed him. The sleeper who remembered the old women's teaching would go limp, would count breaths, would whisper Hypno's name inside the locked cage of the mind, would fix on one small point, a crack in the ceiling, a knot in the wooden beam, the faint glow of the lamp wick, and refuse to look up. Then, eventually, the eastern sky would pale. The weight would hesitate. It would press one final time, hard, deliberate, almost tender, as though memorizing the shape of the ribs it had occupied. Then it would slide away. Breath would rush back, limbs would jerk. A sound, half sob, half gasp would escape, and the sleeper would sit up, trembling, alive, knowing that the bargain had been kept for one more night, but knowing also that tomorrow night the same doors would stand open. The same weight would wait, and the same whispered names would rise again, soft, reluctant, inevitable, into the listening dark. The worst nights were never the ones that ended in gasping relief. They were the ones that refused to end at all. Epiiles could leave the body, the weight would lift, breath would flood back, limbs would remember movement. Yet the dream he carried would remain, not as memory, as residue, a sticky film across the mind that no amount of daylight could quite scrub away. The sleeper rose, splashed water on their face, spoke to family, ate bread and olives, walked beneath the sun, and still felt it, a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness under the breastbone. The certainty that something had followed them out of sleep, and was now sitting quietly in the corner of every room they entered. The Greeks called these lingering visitations onirata hypermon, but dreams that endure. They were rarer than ordinary nightmares, more stubborn than prophecy. A horn dream might foretell a battle or a death, and then fade cleanly at sunrise. An ivory dream might leave behind only a pleasant ache for something that never was. But an Epiiles' dream clung. It did not shout. It did not replay terrifying scenes in broad daylight. It simply stayed, a low hum beneath every thought, a slight hesitation before every breath, the faint, but unmistakable sense that the room is never quite empty. Children were most vulnerable. A boy of 8 in a fishing village near Corinth woke one winter morning, unable to look at the sea. He had dreamed, or been dreamed, of drowning slowly beneath black water, while something held his ankles from below. When he woke, the pressure was gone from his chest, but the sea had changed. Its surface, once friendly and glittering, now felt like a lid. He refused to go near the water. When his father tried to carry him to the boat, he screamed until his voice cracked. The father, who had known Epials himself as a youth, did not force the matter. Instead, he took the boy to the old woman who kept the mugwort pots and the bronze rooster. She listened without interruption, then laid one finger across the child's lips, not to silence him, but to remind him of the gesture that had once protected him in sleep. Say nothing of the dream. She told the father, let him carry it in silence. Words will only feed it. The boy never spoke of the water again, but for 3 winters he slept with his left side down, a sprig of mugwort sewn into his tunic, and a small bronze fish, not a rooster, tied around his neck. The fish was his own idea. He had carved it himself from driftwood and begged his mother to find someone who could cast it in metal. When the bronze fish hung against his chest, he slept without pressure. The dream never returned. But even years later, as a grown man casting nets far from shore, he would sometimes pause mid-haul, look down at the black water, and feel the ghost of fingers around his ankles. Not strong enough to pull, only strong enough to remind. Adults carried their own versions. A woman in Thebes who had lost a child to fever woke one morning certain that the dead girl was still in the room, not as ghost, not as vision, as weight. She felt small knees pressing into her stomach, small hands flat against her ribs, exactly as they had felt when the feverish child had climbed onto her lap in the last days. The pressure was gone by sunrise, but the sensation remained. She could not bear anyone to touch her abdomen, not her husband, not the midwife who came to check for new life. She wore wide girdles even when alone. She slept sitting upright for months. Eventually she sought the crossroads at midnight with a black ewe of her own. She poured the blood herself, whispering the names backward as custom demanded. The weight never returned, but she never again slept flat on her back, and she never again let anyone place a hand on her stomach, not even to feel for a heartbeat. The philosophers tried to explain it. In the cool colonnades of the academy, they spoke of the persistence of the passions, how the soul, once impressed by a strong image, carried the impression forward into waking life the way a seal leaves its mark on wax. Aristotle wrote of dreams as movements remaining from sense, impressions, lingering like ripples after the stone has sunk. Yet even he admitted there were nights when the ripples felt too heavy, too deliberate, as though something had stepped into the wax while it was still soft, and pressed its full weight down. The physicians offered remedies. Galen prescribed mugwort tea before bed, hellebore to purge black bile, but gentle purges to balance the humours. He noted that those who slept on the left side suffered fewer visitations. The heart, being on the left, is pressed less when the body lies that way. the spirit finds less purchase. Yet he also wrote privately, in notes never meant for public eyes, of patients who followed every rule and still woke with the same weight. There are visitations, he concluded in one margin, that no medicine reaches. The priests knew better. They kept small lead tablets in the sanctuaries of hypnose. Curse tablets in reverse. Instead of binding an enemy, they begged the god of sleep to bind his unruly brother. The tablets were inscribed with the sleeper's name, the date, and a single plea: Hypnos, Lord of Quiet, hold back your kinsman. Let him press elsewhere. They were rolled, tied with black thread, and dropped into sacred pits at the edge of temple precincts. No one ever dug them up. They were not meant to be recovered. They were offerings to the dark, payment in advance for nights yet to come. And still epials came, not every night, not to every house, but often enough that every Greek child grew up knowing the posture, the sprig, the bronze bird, the whispered names. They learned to sleep on their left side before they learned to count. They learned to keep mugwort near the bed before they learned their letters. They learned, most importantly, that some nights the mind opens its doors and something walks through without asking permission. And on those nights, the only true defense was endurance. Let it press. Let it stay. Let it finish what it came to do. Because morning would come, eventually, and when it did, the sleeper would rise, breathe deeply, touch their chest where the weight had been, and go about the day carrying the memory like a second skin, a skin no one else could see, a skin that remembered exactly how heavy the dark could become, and how patient it was willing to be. There were people who woke from epials, embrace, and simply changed, not dramatically, not with public weeping or sudden pilgrimage or vows of chastity. Quietly, irreversibly, they rose at dawn like everyone else, folded the blanket, poured water into the basin, greeted family with the same murmured words. Yet something had shifted so deeply inside the architecture of their soul that the old way of being could no longer quite fit. A potter in a village near Mycenae had been visited 3 times in the same winter. Each time the weight settled heavier. Each time he counted breaths until the rooster's call released him. After the 3rd night, he never again slept flat. He built a low wooden frame angled, so that even if he rolled in the night, his body would slide back onto the left side. He kept mugwort in every corner of the house, not just under the pillow, but tied to the rafters, sewn into the hems of every garment, crushed into the clay he worked. His pots began to carry a faint green tint from the powdered leaves mixed into the slip. Customers noticed. They asked why. He only smiled and touched his chest once, the universal gesture for the heavy one came. No one pressed further. His pots sold well. People said they felt safe to drink from. He never explained. He never needed to. A young woman in Lesbos, newly married, woke one morning unable to bear anyone standing behind her. Not her husband. Not her mother-in-law. Not even the shadow of a tree falling across her back. She would flinch, spin around, hand already at her throat as though expecting fingers there. The husband, patient, frightened, asked the old midwife what to do. The midwife came at dusk with a black thread and a bronze needle. She stitched 9 small crosses into the back of the woman's chiton, while the girl sat rigid, eyes fixed on the lamp, flame. When the last knot was tied, the midwife whispered, "Now the weight has somewhere else to settle." The woman never woke Prest again, but for the rest of her life she slept facing the wall, back guarded by stone, front guarded by her husband's breath. She bore 3 children. She never told them why she always slept that way. They never asked. Some knowledge is inherited without words. An old fisherman on Naxos stopped going to sea after a single night. He had dreamed, or been dreamed, of sinking slowly, while something coiled around his calves and pulled. He woke with salt taste in his mouth and the smell of deep water in his hair, though he had never left his mat. The next morning he sold his boat. He took up net, mending on the shore instead. When asked why a man who had fished 40 years would suddenly fear the water, he only shrugged and laid a flat hand across his chest. The gesture was answer enough. His neighbours nodded. They bought his nets. They left him alone. He lived another 23 years on dry land. When he died, they found a small bronze fish tied around his neck, not a rooster, and a sprig of dried mugwort sewn into every seam of every garment he owned. No one removed them before the pyre. They burned with him. These were not the ones who screamed their stories in the agora or carved votive reliefs for the temples. These were the quiet ones, the ones who changed their habits without announcement, who slept angled, who kept plants near the bed, who touched their chest when the conversation turned too loud. They never spoke of again, not because they had forgotten, but because speaking would have given the memory fresh weight. Silence starved it. Silence kept it small. Silence let it shrink until it was only a faint pressure under the breastbone on very cold nights, a reminder, not a return. The philosophers noticed. They wrote treatises on the persistence of fantasia and the lingering motion of the sensitive soul. They spoke of bile and pneuma and the balance of hot and cold. But even Aristotle, in a private note scribbled in the margin of his own manuscript, admitted, "There are impressions that do not fade with waking. They remain like a seal pressed too deeply into wax. The wax remembers the shape even when the seal is gone." He did not name Epiales. He did not need to. The name lived in the silences between the lines. In the villages, in the cities, in the mountain farms, the changed ones carried on. They worked, they loved, they raised children, they grew old. But they never again slept on their backs, without first touching the mugwort, checking the bronze bird, whispering the name of Hypnos 3 times into the dark. And when their own children asked, years later, why grandfather always sleeps tilted, why mother keeps green leaves under the pillow, why father touches his chest when the wind rises at night, they answered the same way. It remembers. No further explanation. None was needed. The gesture had become the story, and the story, like the weight itself, had learned how to stay without ever quite being seen. In the end, Epiales never truly leaves. He only withdraws far enough that the sleeper can breathe again, far enough that the morning light feels ordinary once more, far enough that the day can be lived without constantly touching the place on the chest where the pressure had settled. But he never departs entirely. He lingers in the architecture of the body, in the slight hesitation before lying down at night, in the unconscious habit of rolling to the left side, in the small bronze rooster that still sits on the sill, even though the children are grown and the grandchildren laugh at grandfather's old bird. He lingers in the way certain shadows feel heavier than they should, in the way a quiet room can suddenly feel occupied, in the way breath sometimes catches, for no reason at all, a brief, remembered tightness that passes as quickly as it came. The Greeks accepted this. They did not expect final victory over the night. They expected negotiation. They expected ritual. They expected the understanding that some forces are older than medicine, older than philosophy, older than the very names we give them. Epial's was not an enemy to be slain. He was a condition of being human. The price paid for having a mind that could wander free while the body lay helpless. The cost of possessing a soul that could dream at all. So they built their defences not to banish him forever, but to teach him manners. The mugwort stayed under the pillow until it crumbled to dust and was replaced. The bronze rooster was polished each spring, even when no one remembered why. The stitches were sewn into new garments as the old ones wore thin. The left side was favoured in every bed, in every generation. And when, inevitably, the weight returned after months or years of quiet, the sleeper did not cry out in surprise. They simply sighed, laid one hand flat across their chest, counted the breaths, 1, 2, 3, and waited. Because waiting was the final right. Waiting without panic. Waiting without naming. Waiting with the calm certainty that dawn would come. Not because it had been commanded, but because it always had. And when it did come, pale at first, then rose, then gold, the weight would lift. Not grudgingly this time. Almost gently. As though Epial's, having pressed long enough to remind the sleeper of his presence, had decided, for tonight at least, that the lesson was complete. The sleeper would sit up slowly. They would touch the place on their chest where the pressure had been. They would find no mark. They would rise, pour water, greet the day. They would carry the memory like an old scar, tender when pressed, but no longer bleeding. And somewhere, in the borderland between horn and ivory, between waking and dreaming, Epial's would fold himself back into shadow, not defeated, not banished, only waiting, patient, unhurried, knowing the door would open again. Because every night the same invitation is issued simply by closing the eyes. And every night he accepts, quietly, inevitably, without ever needing to ask permission. Yet the sleeper, wiser now, quieter now, no longer fears the visit quite so much. Because they have learned the oldest secret of all. The weight is never the terror. The terror is believing you are alone beneath it. But you are never alone. Hypnos is there. The gentle brother, holding the edges of the night so it does not tear. The Oniroi are there, fluttering just beyond sight, carrying messages you may or may not wish to hear. And Epial's is there, not as punishment, but as reminder. Reminder that the body is fragile. That breath is loaned. That sleep is a country with its own borders and its own border guards. So when the weight settles once more, months later, years later, the sleeper does not fight. They breathe, they count, they wait, and when the sky finally lightens and the pressure slides away, they rise without haste. They touch their chest once, gently, in acknowledgement. They whisper, barely voiced, into the morning airy, "Thank you for the lesson." Then they step into the day, carrying the memory, carrying the weight that is no longer heavy, carrying the quiet certainty that night will come again, and they will be ready, because they have learned. Some visitors do not knock, but some sleepers learn how to open the door without fear. And when they do, the night, for all its shadows, becomes only another room in the house of being, a room with its own rules, its own guests, and its own slow, patient dawn. The rooster crows, the mugwort releases its scent. The sleeper breathes fully once, twice, 3 times, and somewhere, in the place where dreams are born and die, Epiles folds his wings one last time for that night. Not gone, never gone, only waiting, quiet, heavy, and, in his own way, teaching. The sleeper smiles faintly, the smallest possible smile, and begins the day. The night has ended. The next one has not yet begun. And between the two lies the whole wide world of waking, fragile, beautiful, and entirely their own, until the eyelids grow heavy once more, and the door, as it always does, opens again. The story ends here, with the weight lifted for one more morning, the sleeper still breathing, the night still waiting, and the quiet understanding that some lessons are never quite finished. Good night.